I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. My theme today is masculinity studies, and my message to men and non-feminist women is beware. Masculinity studies is almost always the study of men through a feminist lens, and that's certain to involve an at best limited, at worst deformed view of men. The case of masculinity studies as it currently exists disproves the hope that so-called moderate feminism is salvageable and can be made to accommodate men's issues. The fact is that when you start with false premises, women's oppression under patriarchy, gender as a social construct, you end up with a bad theory, even when some of those working with the theory have good intentions, or at least think they have good intentions. Recently, there was an article in the New York Times entitled "A Master's Degree in ... Masculinity." It's a long article, fairly positive, about the role of a professor named Michael Kimmel in the development of masculinity studies. Kimmel is the author of, among many other books, Manhood in America, A Cultural History, Guyland, The Perilous World Where Boys Become Men, and Angry White Men. The latter a book in which he takes pains to disassociate himself from and belittle the men's rights movement. Now, Kimmel is a superstar in the sphere of high-powered, socially acceptable discussions of gender. He lectures all over the place, he liaises with government ministries, and he was the first man to deliver the International Women's Day lecture at the European Parliament. He's beloved by big-time activists like Jane Fonda and Gloria Steinem, and when we read about his version of masculinity studies, we can understand why. What does it mean to be a man today, according to Michael Kimmel and his feminist friends? Well, according to the New York Times article, men are in crisis, which is pretty strong language and a marked contrast to the standard emphasis of feminists on male privilege. But unfortunately, the list of what constitutes this crisis is not very helpful. Here it is, in part: mental illness, suicide, terrorism, rape, mass shootings, jetliner crashes, and young black men being killed by the police. Well, that list really jumbles together a lot of different kinds of crisis, some of it, terrorism, rape, and mass shootings, for example, focusing much more on men as perpetrators of violence than as victims of structural social inequity. So we've got a big problem right there. But at least the article and Kimmel's work seems to be addressing the fact that men have some issues worth taking seriously. Unfortunately, the rest of the article makes it clear that masculinity studies, as Michael Kimmel has developed it at Stony Brook University, where he founded a Center for the Study of Men and Masculinities, is really classic man-blaming feminism, but with a more exclusive focus on masculinity as a problem needing to be fixed. Yes, the article actually comes out and says, presumably with Kimmel's endorsement, that men are the source of most of the world's problems. Here's the quotation. "If we had a better understanding of men, scholars wonder, how many of the world's ills could we solve, or at least attempt to?" Well, that quotation tells us probably all we need to know about these so-called studies. But let's look at how it gets there. The article begins with a cameo of discussion about the differences between the phrase good man and real man. Kimmel gets some men and women together and asks them to tell what they think when they hear those phrases, good man and real man. Not surprisingly, they have different associations with these phrases, just as they would if the phrases were good woman and real woman. The discussion leads Kimmel to proclaim that American men are confused about what it means to be a man. Well, wait a minute. That's his big point? That American men are confused? Anyone reading this who has heard for the past 40 years about the problems women face in our society, real objective problems like rape and sexual harassment and job discrimination and the wage gap, well, they're likely going to think if that's men's biggest problem, they don't need a bunch of university courses to help them with their confusion. It all seems trivial. Then Gloria Steinem is quoted at the first international conference on men and masculinities, organized by Kimmel. And here's what she has to say about the study of masculinity. She says, men's life expectancy increases by 3 to 4 years if you eliminate causes of death attributable to masculinity, such as death from violence, death from speeding, and death from tension-related diseases. What other movement can offer men 3 to 4 more years? She asks. The quotation seems sympathetic at first, but on second thought, we see that what she is saying is that men are their own worst enemies. Masculinity equals violence. Masculinity equals stupidity in cars. Even tension-related diseases are caused by masculinity, according to Steinem. The statement about men's problems, then, is really a nasty slam at masculinity as the source of terminal illnesses and violent death. And Michael Kimmel's own remarks constantly circle back to the problems that men purportedly cause in our society, especially rape, rather than to the problems that they face. In fact, rape as a problem of men that needs to be cured is mentioned no less than 4 times in the article, once as sexual assault. And a great deal of the discussion about masculinity places a high priority on men becoming more like the ideal partners, fathers, and political allies that feminists have always said they need to be, by, for example, taking their fair share in housework and child-rearing. The closer we read, the more it seems that Kimmel's whole message is that the male failure to realize that feminism is good for men too is the main source of men's problems today. The article has not a word to say about any of the structural problems that men encounter in society. Their lack of equality before the law when it comes to criminal sentencing, for example, the fact that men receive higher sentences for the exact same crimes as women, the bias against men in family court, their lack of reproductive rights, the lack of funding for research on male diseases, the lack of due process in cases of claimed rape and sexual harassment, and so on. Michael Kimmel says not a word about any of these. He's too busy making nice with his feminist colleagues and telling men that they're the problem. Well, if masculinity studies won't look honestly and comprehensively at the systemic problems that men face, the problems that men themselves are identifying as factors behind mental illness, incarceration rates, and skyrocketing male suicide, and if it won't own up to the role of feminist thought and activism in contributing to those problems, then I, for one, don't believe that it can be a positive force in the analysis of men's lives. It's a funny kind of advocacy for men that tells men to get with the feminist program and own up to their role as the source of world evil. And I would counsel any man I know to avoid it like the plague.